on Zoom. So we'll get going. So our first speaker or speakers is Heidi Holman and Mark Ellingwood of the New Hampshire Butterfly Monitoring Project. Heidi is a supervising wildlife biologist for the New Hampshire Fish and Game's Non-Game and Endangered Species Program, where she oversees multiple butterfly and mammal projects. Mark is a retired wildlife biologist and former wildlife division chief for New Hampshire Fish and Game, and an active volunteer with New Hampshire Fish and Game's Butterfly Monitoring Project. So without further ado, Heidi. Yes.
Great. Hello. Good. Okay, so Mark Ellingwood is not going to be joining me today. He is a volunteer extraordinaire, so don't hold it against him. But he has been integral in our work with the Harris Center in creating the inaugural count for the Super Sanctuary Butterfly Club. So I just wanted to start out, if you were lucky enough to hear Sam Jaffe talk this morning, it was very inspirational to hear about a patch, a place that you get to know. He talked about hundreds of species that he observed in this one location just by returning there repeatedly, and all the stories that he had about the experience. And that just sounded so wonderful. And maybe you wanted to become like that. You wanted to have those great things. And yet it seemed overwhelming because it was so impressive. And I'm hoping that what we're talking about today will give you an opportunity, something that's really easy to get started on that journey. So Sam also mentioned that there are 3,000, 4,000 caterpillars that are present in New Hampshire. So that's moths and butterflies. So when we talk about butterflies alone, there's about 100, 110 species. That's still an awful lot, and so many more than what we found people knew about. Many times people are familiar with the monarch or the eastern tiger swallowtail, those really large, showy butterflies that you see, but they don't actually recognize a skipper in the field. They may not be aware of hair streaks or sulfurs. They just, the whole world that is right in front of their eyes. At New Hampshire Fish and Game, in our program, we only have had the resources and opportunities to tackle the most at-risk species, those that are federally or state protected. The Carner blue butterfly was extirpated from the state in 2000, and we had to work diligently to try to bring it back. And we need to do better, and we need to do more. The Wildlife Action Plan is the roadmap for us to keep common species common, and that includes all those 100 other butterfly species besides this handful that are up here. When we talk about the work we've done for rare butterflies to date, just to give you an idea, they're usually associated with really rare habitats like pine barrens. They're distributed along the Merrimack River corridor and isolated patches in Carroll County. They come from very sandy deposits that were left behind by glaciers. They're hot, they're dry, they're fire adapted. And that fire that rolls through selects for the species, including the plants. And as we heard, caterpillars often have host plants that they're very specific to. And the Carner blue is one of those. It's dependent on the wild blue lupin, a very rare perennial pea family plant. And so our work is to reestablish habitat for them because fire was suppressed for so long. Also, these sandy soils along the Merrimack River are our most developed corridors for people moving north from Nashua and Manchester, but also they're easy to develop because there's very little site work when you have sandy soils. And we had to recreate that fire component because there's actually intricate relationships that the fire was doing with bacteria and soils and things to make that lupin grow. And so again, it takes recreating the habitat, and then we actually had to rear and release the animals, and over 20 years we're just barely meeting our federal recovery goals. So that's a lot of work in the worst case scenario, and we want to try to avoid that in the future. Some of our other work with at-risk species and how we respond to those that are declining in the alpine zone of the White Mountains. Again, another rare, very unique ecosystem in New Hampshire. 16 miles of the presidential range above 4,500 feet, where there's tundra similar to that you'd find in northern Canada. Very unique plant communities, very unique weather patterns and adaptations of species that live there. And so we're working with the White Mountain Arctic and the White Mountain butterfly, both endemic to our state. That means they don't live anywhere else. And with the Fish and Wildlife Service, we're trying to find out basic information, like what do they eat as caterpillars? And then we're trying to project what's going to happen to them in the face of climate change. Specifically, on top of that alpine zone, we know that snowpack, wind patterns, weather is going to be very significantly altered. So insects, butterflies overall, they're getting hammered from all angles, all kinds of things that we're doing as we live our lives and how we steward the world. Development, fragmentation, conversion of habitat, pesticides to control insects result in direct mortality. Herbicides may accidentally kill their host plants, is the case with milkweed in large industrial agriculture for monarchs. Disease and parasitoids, as we saw, are a natural controlling mechanism, but they can also be altered in their densities, and they could have different impacts on this balance that we typically see. So it's super important that for us to start to understand the threats, to start to get to these more common species, we need to know more about those individual species themselves. And one way that we do this is we've got to find their distribution and abundance. It's just very basic information. And so far in New Hampshire, the best record compiled that we had was in 2013, when the Audubon Society took large data sets from Fish and Game, the National Guard, Nature Conservancy, people who were really focusing on Lepidoptera and conservation, and they said, what do we have? And the result was many towns had 0 species reported, many towns had less than 10 species reported, and that's just not the case. That's just a data gap. That's something that, wow, look at what we can do together. We can start to improve this, and that's what I want to challenge you to today and invite you to join in. I think we can succeed in this mission together with butterflies in a really effective way. Butterflies just lend themselves to people participating in getting this information. They're not quite as tricky as birds in that spring window and you're trying to get your binoculars on them, or you have to learn all their calls and you have to do this or do that. Butterflies are around from March to now, actually, we're seeing them, which is a little scary, but they're beautiful, they're bright, they catch your attention, they fly during the day when it's nice out, so you don't mind being outside too, and they pose. Many of them are nectaring on flowers, and they're just gonna hang out while you take their photo and you go back and identify them. So we can do this well together. Also, with the network design, what we're trying to say is you can participate at any level, at any volume, at any effort, any amount, anytime, anywhere. It's just so available. So many people have been using iNaturalist just out of their own curiosity. Maybe you're using it to identify something you've seen. Maybe you're keeping your own log of species, doing a BioBlitz somewhere. And we're saying, yes, do it. Opportunistic data is definitely one way. You can do 1 butterfly a year, you could do 10, you could do 1,000. And I definitely have to shout out to Steve Lamond, who is our top butterfly reporter on iNaturalist right now. There's other ways that we can do this, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Opportunistic data has value, and it's in large volumes, but we also have the opportunity to do better and come up with a structured design to have more quantitative data that can be relevant to people nationally. So again, iNaturalist, If you're so inclined to use it, I would also suggest you join the New Hampshire Butterfly Monitoring Project. If you're not familiar, there's projects on iNaturalist. And this project, every time you go into it, it sweeps up all the observations that are butterflies in the state of New Hampshire. So it's constantly updating. When we started, there were 5,000 to 6,000 observations of butterflies from the first 13 years of the project. As of right now, there's almost 11,000 observations. In this 1 year, people have almost doubled that amount just by answering this call. So I'd like to see that keep going. When you join the project, you have the ability to sort through the information. It's just going to be a running list of who saw what on what day. So you may see that Mark Ellingwood was out and he saw the monarch in June 3rd, and you're like, wow, I haven't seen one yet. I'm going to go looking for one. Or someone saw an early hair streak up in the Second College Grant, and you're a person who wants to increase your life list, and off you go up a couple hours north because you know that it's flying. So there's an opportunity to really get cued in and to learn a little bit more about phenology and the species on your own. What's so cool about this, again, it's the volume that we're going to generate together. There's no standards, there's no effort, there's no parameters on what day you were there, if it was raining, what type of habitat, but cumulatively, this information has so much value because here you can see, if you click on a species, it starts to show you distribution of that species. Remember that Audubon map was really shy? Well, this is going to do it. This will fill it in. This is going to let us know also those unique observations as climate is changing and things are moving further north. Are they just arriving to New Hampshire, or are they moving towards the Canadian border in a way that we've never seen them? Also, we're going to get really detailed information on phenology. So we may have anticipated that one species had a generation in May and June, and that's it. It's the only time we ever see that species as an adult flying around, but all of a sudden someone's reporting it in August. Now we know they're having 2 generations per year in New Hampshire because something's changed, and that's really new, valuable information, and that can lead us to further investigations. When it comes to the North American butterfly count, so this has been established since about 1992, 93, and it's a national count, very similar to the Christmas bird count. And it's a 4th of July, so 6 months later, roughly, in the peak of butterfly flights in most places, especially in the northern temperate zones. And here's a map of the existing count circles prior to some of our work in this past year, and there really aren't any for northern New England, and in New Hampshire there was only one. What's interesting about this data, again, we're standardizing how we collect it, so we have the opportunity to use it in a completely different way and to have much greater results. So this data says, what time did you start? How long were you out there? What was the weather like? What was the habitat like? How far did you walk when you did it? How many did you see? You're starting to increase that ability to make better assumptions about populations and also species communities within the state. So here's the map of the super sanctuary point count circle. And so this, again, was the inaugural year, and we reached out, Mark Ellingwood as a head volunteer, and to Brett and Susie and Karen, and we said, we'd like to get going, but we want to anchor this with an institution that will help us carry it along into the future, because the value of this data is for it to continue every year, time over time. That's going to show us trends and change and declines and increases. So this is a pretty big circle, and the way that it works is you need to cover a bunch of properties, a minimum of 6 hours with 4 parties in a day. So we needed people to join us. We needed at least 4 people, but really we knew we needed more than that to cover a 15-mile diameter circle. And so we worked with them to establish a butterfly club, which was meeting once a month, January through April. We chose to do Zoom. And Mark led people through the process of learning butterflies. So now, instead of just knowing the monarch and the eastern tiger swallowtail or Canadian tiger swallowtail, they learned 40 species in 4 months. We did a 2-hour field day to practice what it would be like to actually conduct the survey, taught people how to net, record the data. That gave them a few weeks to maybe do this on their own and practice. They got to be familiar with the actual size of a butterfly. They had just been doing that via books and photos. So very successful. We had 35 participants during those 4 months. They were learning key terms like ventral and dorsal, which is stomach and back sort of thing, but you have identifying features that reference them. They're learning outer margin of the hind wing where there might be a certain dot or things like that. They were getting these chances to test themselves at the beginning and end of every class, and so it was, oh, gee, did you know? Could you tell which one was the mourning cloak and which was the swallowtail? So really challenging people. And again, we used the same guide for everyone, and people got to learn how to use that guide well. So then when they actually got out in the field, they weren't intimidated at all. Learned how to reference, read host plants, habitat, range maps. So the results of our first year, we definitely saw a lot of species in one day. I mean, it's one day in July, and if you're familiar, some butterflies only fly in May and some only fly in August. So we're not going to see all 100. I'm sure we can improve on this, but this is a really great start. And we saw 850 individual butterflies. So it's an active day. And our day was cut short because it was 90 degrees. So there's probably a lot more that we could have accomplished. And people learned a lot of the particular species that were flying then. The common wood nymph was one of our predominant species. There were hundreds of them that day. I know lots of people said, I never knew that butterfly, but I will never forget it, because they saw so many. So overall, again, very successful work. So our vision is to continue this model. That was a pilot. We actually piloted another one in the Lake Sunapee area. They did the same 4 meetings, field trips, and we completed a similar effort. They didn't see as many butterflies, but they did see a few more species. So, you know, we're having these conversations, starting to communicate, and we'd like to have 6 of these across the range, across the state in the next year, and we will be doing that. We have a capital area butterfly club in conjunction with New Hampshire Audubon starting this winter, a Conway count with the Tin Mountain Conservation Center, and also the Estuarine Research Reserve is our coastal partner. And we'll continue with Lake Sunapee, we'll continue with the Harris Center. I've heard other people already mentioning, what about the Monadnock region and working with the Conservancy? Can we get more detail? Is there something with bear paw? All of these things are possible. It's how we can grow together and engage each other. In addition, our goal is to up that iNaturalist count, and as I said, in year 1, we surpassed the goal of that. So I'd like to see that continue and persist, and really it's just gonna be having fun together. Right now, we're using Nature Groupie as our main platform to advertise these opportunities, but we're building a website together, and we're going to be able to make it more interactive. We'll try to schedule more field trips on a regular basis for people to get out, different statewide Zoom training opportunities for higher levels of skipper learning. If you're familiar with butterflies, they're kind of the gold standard of hitting a level of competency. And so I just say, you know, come join us, have fun, let's see what we can do, and this data will all be part of the Wildlife Action Plan revision in 2025. So, thank you.
Questions for Heidi?
So, Restoring America's Wildlife Act is a very large funding vehicle to bring money to state wildlife agencies in a way that we've never had historically. We receive about $400,000 a year from the federal government right now, and this would bring us to $11 million a year, straight for conservation of rare and endangered and non-game species, so it's substantial. We have passed the House with funding, and they've been waiting to make the vote in the Senate. It's the furthest the bill has gotten in about 20 years of trying for this type of funding. They were waiting till after the election, and my guess is they may move ahead. You know, they may go ahead. The biggest thing is they're trying to figure out how to pay for it exactly. So it's had multiple options, but stay tuned.
Any other questions? Yes, Wendy.
When you were doing these surveys, the big butterfly day, do you have to capture them all? I saw people with had captures were talking about that. So on that, is it you have to catch each butterfly that you're documenting that day?
Absolutely not. Nope. What we did at times is,
Yeah, sorry, let me repeat that question. So the question was, during the field days, do they actually have to capture the butterflies that they're documenting? Is that right?
yeah, so when we were capturing them, we were trying to give people an opportunity to observe them up close, those field markers. Maybe that's their first encounter with that species. So again, if we saw 50 on our individual walks as one of the 4 groups of the common wood nymph, after the first time, we don't need to look at it again. We know what it is. So it's that sort of thing. You do want to err on the side of not inaccurately identifying a species. So many times with smaller skippers, we may handle them more frequently just to confirm the species. But it's a real choice of the group and not required.
Still have a couple minutes for questions. Any Zoom questions coming in, Peter? Nothing? Yes.
Great talk. Great to see this. Is there any future thoughts about expanding this to other insect taxa like bees or bumblebees or moths or beetles, similar to what Vermont has been doing?
Great. So real quick, the question is there any thoughts on expanding this to other taxa, beetles, bees, other than butterflies?
I think the answer is yes. Will it be in the next 5 years or 10 years? It depends. You know, there's a capacity issue, and then also different taxa need a different approach. So butterflies are easier because they're during the day and they're pretty visible. Moths require night work, and there's so many thousands of species, you often have to look at them under a microscope to confirm the species. So you might need a different group of citizen scientists of a different level to accommodate that. Same thing with bees. I think bumblebees, we could do something with a broader audience. There's only 14 species, maybe 16 in New Hampshire, and they're a little bit more specific on their markings, but when you get into the 200 plus bees of ground nesting bees and such, I think we might struggle again. So but we're definitely open to any ideas of what people could propose on how to get to the point that we know this information and can start conservation efforts.
All right, well then let's thank Heidi.